Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Brampton Board of Trade Business Insights events. I'm Lindsay Ingle, the Dean for the Faculty of Applied Science and Technology at Sheridan College, and we'll be joining the Board of Directors in 2023 for the Brampton Board of Trade. As you know, colleges and universities play a pivotal role in preparing tomorrow's workforce, so I'm eager to hear this morning's webinar. Before we get started, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather in the region of Peel operates on the treaties and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land and continue to do so today. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwa Chippewa peoples. The land is home to the Métis and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, who were direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land and by doing so, give our respect to its inhabitants. It is our pleasure today to have you join me and our speaker, Mike, for today's talk. It is my pleasure to thank Algonquin University for their sponsorship of today's event. Through the support of partners like Algoma, the Board of Trade continue to host valuable events like this one. With that, let's get into the meat of today's webinar. It's no secret the labor market has changed, and I know we are all feeling these changes. In every sector, the impact is being felt. As every industry struggles to find and retain staff, it all comes down to one question: where did all the people go? Why, in our post-pandemic climate, is it so hard to find staff? What does this mean for planning for the next 5 to 10 years, and how as businesses can we adapt? Fellow business people, I have these same questions, especially when it comes to future planning. Fortunately, we are joined today by Mike Jackson, Senior Manager, Workforce Transformation, Consumer Lead at Deloitte. Mike is a senior manager with the Human Capital Practice in Toronto, focusing on the future of work and talent acquisition. He has roughly 13 years of experience working with clients on their talent strategies and talent acquisition programs. With a deep understanding of talent in both the public and private sector, Mike has worked with local and global organizations on a variety of strategic initiatives, ranging from their development of the future of work strategy to workforce planning to defining the attraction and retention strategies. Mike is part of Deloitte's Global Future Work program and has worked on initiatives that not only define the talent disruptors, but also develop approaches and solutions for organizations, not only to embrace, but to lead the change on the horizon. Mike is a graduate of York University and has been published as a contributor to author Olivia McGavre's book, 4 Generations, One Workplace, and presented at various conferences across North America. When not working, Mike is obviously very busy with his 4 kids and a dog, juggling between soccer, acting, baseball, karate, gymnastics, and of course, hockey. We wouldn't be Canadian without that. In terms of the format today, Mike is going to take us through the research and results from the extensive work that Deloitte has done in this area, and we'll have an opportunity for questions afterwards, so you can prepare for that. Without any further ado, I'll hand the control over to Mike.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you again for having me. I'm just going to pull up my screen. And we understand that the struggles that organizations are facing with this regard. Problems that existed before the pandemic has become, greatly exacerbated in the last little while. And as a result, you're struggling with increased vacancy rates, a higher than average attrition rate, higher turnovers, potential increase in retirement rates, begging the question of what's happening. And so what we want to today is talk a little bit about what is happening in the labor market. What are some of the stats that we're seeing? I'll reference some of the research we've done as well as others along the way. And at the end, we'll provide you a link with some reference material and research that we've done with our chief economist, Craig Alexander, and the work that he does with the federal government and some of the financial institutions in Canada. And fundamentally, as I said, you're not alone. We get this a lot. And it is a very fascinating question when we start to unpack what is happening in the labor market. So what I want to do is something we call zoom out and then zoom in. And so when we zoom out, we're going to look at some of the bigger macro trends that are happening, some of the statistics, some of the patterns that we're seeing, and some of the weird things that we do as humans when it comes to the way we work, things around hybrid work, remote, on-site, and some of the behaviors that exist there. And then what we'll do is zoom in around what are some of the things we're seeing organizations do to respond, and how are they actually tackling these issues head on, and perhaps hoping for practical, tactical things that you can take away within your own respective organizations that can help change the narrative when it comes to where did all the people go. So with that mindset of zooming out, we want to talk a bit about what happened, because before 2020, Canada, North America, the world was on a journey of exploring something we call the future of work. And so this was the concept of humans and machines working together to perform tasks, engaging things like the gig economy and crowdsourcing to get new ideas, and exploring more hybrid ways of working. Why do I have to be in the office 5 days a week? Maybe I could be in 3 or 2, and so forth. So these are trends that were already on the way. But what happened is 2020, we proved that it could work. And so in 2016, 4% of our workforce was remote. In 2019, it was 17%. And then at the end of 2021, so we don't count 2020 because that was a big shift where everybody did, we still kind of leveled off at 32%. And so you can see this trend growing. And depending where you look in the world, it's even higher than where we are as a national average. And we know that this can work. We've seen the struggles as a result of this. We've seen what prolonged remote work can do to our human behaviors and the ways in which we work together. But there is still a shift in terms of mindset, and not everyone wants to be remote entirely. And so you'll see in kind of the bottom right is we still have a good percentage that prefer to be remote. But what this tells us is it's an empowered remote strategy. So it's not all or none, meaning, you're 5 days a week from home or you're on site. What we're struggling with right now in Canada is this middle ground of how do I balance, the flexibility and empowerment to be remote sometimes, on site other times. Where this gets really tricky is there's no equity necessarily in certain types of employment. So work that is on site, work that is transportation driven, work that is hands-on tools, manufacturing, retail, and so forth. How do you achieve that kind of parity when the work itself requires you to be on site? And this is where we're seeing some really interesting kind of new dilemmas come up around, when you have a corporate location, let's say, where you're able to work remote, you be more on site, you embed flexibility into kind of your knowledge worker staff. And then you have those that are on site who just don't have that luxury, who need to be on site. And so we're seeing little kind of tactics appear around micro empowerment, shift sharing, asset removal. So the idea of if you've got trucks and assets that are locked in a lot, working with insurance companies to actually allow you to take those assets home. And so you don't, less time on the road, less time commuting, more time being productive and balancing your home life for employees. So lots of interesting tactics that pop up here. But fundamentally, when we look at kind of the broad scope, it's a trend that's going to continue. And as we see this, productivity was achieved, and many people argue productivity went up through some various types of remote work. But the desire to do that is still there. It's not going to go away anytime soon, but the type of remote work will start to change, and we'll see that slowly shift over time. And it's going to change how we engage our talent and how we offer interesting ways of working. The problem with this, as I've kind of alluded to, is it didn't work for everybody. So there's some interesting components that we see in terms of demographics, particularly when we looked at women who had to balance the work from home and the reality of home life. And what we saw was some fascinating thing where 1 in 6 men within the SVP or C-suite, kind of that executive cohort, they were leaving their roles versus 1 in 4 in terms of women. So we saw a fundamental shift there. And what this was when we peeled back the layers and understand what was happening, it was this concept of just surviving, right? And so 56% of working moms describe themselves just surviving or struggling, and a smaller percentage actually said thriving. And so what this meant was the pressures were starting to hit women disproportionately than they were against men. And again, that's that sustainment piece, right? This is not sustainable as a society, as a whole, as a workforce. It's not something we can actually manage. And so this started to kind of demonstrate the cracks that we saw coming in from 2020. And we saw this shift as the health crisis started to abate in various degrees, returning to work started to increase. We saw some of these numbers shift, but there were some other fascinating things that we started to see in terms of unemployment rates. We saw, in terms of the number of school-age children being able to enter the workforce and the limitations they had around access to education. during the pandemic, which was staggering as well. And then again, we saw varying shifts in unemployment and employment rates against men and women. And so these cracks started to kind of manifest here and there. And we heard a lot about this in the media. We saw some of this in our own personal lives, trying to balance work while having kids at home. And even now, fast forward, where a lot of us still may work from home from time to time, or balance a staff that is also maybe partially hybrid. And so measuring things like performance and how do I ensure my people are doing well? How do I give them the space to actually balance their family lives and work lives? And so, this created some interesting components in terms of, we can't sustain this. And so it generated a lot of shift in the marketplace, but it also empowered people to start to realize, maybe I don't need to do this. And that was a big question that started to rise. We pivoted right at that down trough where these pressures started to manifest themselves. We were at that breaking point. And then we started to see a bit of a shift in economic recovery. And so now you had a workforce that was slightly disenfranchised and seeing, opportunities on the horizon to actually be more flexible and more nimble in their work. And this started to create kind of that concept we all heard about, which was the Great Resignation. And so it was a bit of a perfect storm that manifested itself. We also had this phenomenon of generational shift, where we actually saw a workforce 55 plus exit the workforce at a greater rate than the prime working age was entering. So we saw a bit of a shift there. And again, this created that empowered scenario where people started to realize there's actually now potentially more opportunities than there are individuals available. And so again, that storm was kind of brewing as we saw that shift from 2020, early 2021. And a lot of these were the realities that organizations and individuals were starting to face. And so that great exhaustion actually cost Canada a lot of money. It cost a lot of us our personal sacrifices. And so as you start to see, 46% of Canadians new to remote work, report accomplishing more work per hour. And so what this meant was we felt more pressure to do work. I can speak for myself. My calendar now has no breaks in between. You just go from one call to the next. I never used to do that. I would have time to either physically go to the next meeting room, or I would just plan my day accordingly. But now our calendars are the property of everybody else. And so as a result, you just get booked in these 30-minute increments or 1 hour increments, and you just accomplish, more conversations, more what you need to do, but less balance. And as a result, you start to extend your hours and you do more. And so we saw that happen. And that, again, that burnout was starting to manifest itself. There was overall, dissatisfaction with the workforce. People started to realize I'm just exhausted. And when we looked at some of the survey data that was out there, 54% felt overworked and 39% just were done, right? Felt overall exhausted. And it wasn't just a single cohort. When we started to look across demographics, different leadership styles, different points in career, it was pretty consistent. And you start to see kind of, in the bottom here, the exception, some people will say, was business leaders. They reported themselves as thriving. But when you start to talk to leaders, I think this is interesting, is the rise of mental health awareness actually saw an increase in mental health leaves across business leaders. And so while there was this pressure to say I'm doing well, and this pressure to show up and say I'm a leader and I'm the rock in my organization, this manifests itself in other areas of mental health concerns. And so there was this break in transparency across business leaders as we hit this great exhaustion moment. Failure to identify and failure to kind of show up and say, I am a person as well, and I feel these struggles. They are real in my house, in my life. And so some of these stats are quite interesting as you start to peel away around the supporting evidence that doesn't necessarily back it up in terms of the business leader point of exhaustion. So, this created a breaking point, as I said. And as a result of this, we went to the Great Resignation. And it was kind of known. We saw these stats on the horizon, this breaking point that we reached with our workforce. We were overworked. We were feeling the confluence of our personal lives and our business lives. There's very little difference between them anymore. Our calendars became the property of everybody else. They were filled in. We had, this productivity expectation where we thought we had to thrive. Some people will also say that during COVID, there was also this mindset of I had to double my output to prove my value because there was fear of layoffs and downsizing, and very much a reality for many Canadians that had to struggle with that. And what ended up happening is many people just shifted. And all in all, about 14 million people have exited the labor market altogether. In Canada, I think it was about 330,000 people just never came back in terms of 55 and plus. And so where did they go, right? What happened? And so there was an exodus of people, but not enough to create the reality that we're seeing. What we ended up seeing was more of an acute skills shortage. And so in certain areas, what we realize is there's 5 big shifts that happen. And as we saw the exodus of the 55 plus, the emergence of the prime workforce was not enough to backfill. That demonstrated the constraint we have in our economy. And we're very much a kind of a fractured economy where we have as a workforce comprised mainly of a constricted workforce bound by demographics. We have an underutilized workforce in terms of various, new Canadians, underutilized communities across Canada, and we have 100% reliance on immigration for labor force participation rate growth. And so this is our sort of locked in, immobile workforce that we have to work with. And as a result of that, when industry started to shift and we saw growth in certain sectors, these acute shortages manifest themselves in a skills gap. And a great example is in mining right now. The unemployment rate in Saskatchewan for mining is 0.5%. If you take the total labor force participation of people who identify as miners in Saskatchewan and multiply that, it's about 63 people who don't have a job. That's it. And again, mining is a very interesting skill set. It's learned and trained at the same time. And frankly, there just aren't any in the province. And so there's 4,000 vacant positions and about 63 people available to work. So we can imagine the reality that they're struggling with. But if you look at other sectors, the same pressure doesn't exist. And so there's this kind of shift where you're looking at kind of cohorts of individuals who are seeing opportunities and relatively stable conditions. They're not seeing the massive swing in terms of increased demand over supply. And then other areas where demand far exceeds supply and there's nobody there. And so this is kind of what's driving people to realize is I've got options. I don't need to stay. And when we looked at the study that Microsoft did, within their own workforce, 41% considering changing. And number of Canadians who said they're dissatisfied have tripled since June 2020. What this means is they're empowered. And we've heard this before, before COVID, the war for talent was a classic verbiage that we all use probably at some point. I kind of like to say the war is over. It's done. Talent won. There's no way around it. Talent is the dominant winner, and they are empowered in many different ways right now. And where we were in terms of this great resignation, driving from the great exhaustion, has further empowered them. And that gap between the balance of power has shifted. And so this is where we find ourselves today, right? Many organizations looking at this reality and thinking, well, how am I to respond, right? How do I understand this? How do I deal with this? Mike, you're sitting here telling me it's all doom and gloom, that my workforce is exhausted, they're tired, they're burned out, and they're leaving. Again, that's the caveat. They're not really leaving. What we're seeing is skills shifting. And there's many things organizations do to respond to that. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the important caveat here is we want to really focus on the key point is that in Canada, our supply still exceeds demand. It is not the same in the US. They actually have an inverse market right now where it's a complete flip. So we are at that threshold though, where that gap, imagine, the 2 lines going of demand and supply, you want a healthy gap between the two, but ours are very close right now, almost touching. And that's that point where we're kind of at, but still, we still have more supply. The problem we have is it's the wrong supply for the market and the demands that we need today. And so how do we close this gap becomes a bit of a problem because we like the way we work. We talked about the idea of the remote work. We enjoy it, but it's going to stay. And we look at preference. People are still looking for that flexibility. 9 out of 10 Canadians still want flexibility in the way, where and when they work. There's kind of the dread and anxiety in terms of this I don't want to go back, right? This kind of threshold point where organizations are still deciding, what do we do? What's our return to office strategy? And this idea of, being risk adverse, overachievers, for the career ladder, we see people jumping, right? The idea now is that you work to learn. You don't learn to work anymore. Historically, when you went to university, get a degree, you go off to school, college, when it be, and so forth. What we're seeing is the half-life of a degree or certificate is starting to shrink. And the idea is that now you learn more from working in your organization through your career than you do actually through, kind of the formal education and or on-job training. You carry that forward into your life. And so the totality of your learning experience is what people are now striving to. And when you look at why the reasons people leave their organizations, development is always and consistently in the top 3. And what this means is people want to thrive. They want learning experiences. They want to embrace that and carry that forward throughout their careers. And then they want the flexibility in their careers to determine where, when, and how they work. But when you look at some of the, those organizations, the individuals that want to work one day a week from home, it's interesting, right? It's not universal, right? After the pandemic, it's not always higher. Obviously, during the pandemic, we saw it, but the key here is when you look at the green bars on the left and the yellow on the right, it's consistently higher. And so that desire to have at least one day a week at home is important. And we do get questions around, well, how? How do I do that if I'm in manufacturing or construction and so forth? And we'll get to a little bit later, but there are ways you can actually create a bit of parity. Looking at the tasks that individuals perform, what of those tasks can actually be kind of lifted out of the day-to-day, or what of those tasks actually need to be done on site versus remote. And again, we're seeing some of this in the natural resources sector, where people are being able to not be on site, the classic 5 days a week, shifting to 4 on, 1 off, right? And different things like that in terms of what's the work you're asking them to do. So that's the reality. And it's not meant to be scary. It's not meant to intimidate. But the idea here is, what's the future? What is going to happen? As an organization, how do I respond to these realities? What do I need to do to engage my workforce? And is there anything that's going to kind of naturally right-size itself for the market? So, before I get into some of these strategies in terms of what we're seeing, there is the if you've read the news, there's always a bit of a narrative right now around upcoming recession. I did speak to our chief economist about this, and in the report that we'll provide, there's a closing argument there as well. What we're forecasting is the recession will create, certain acute labor shortages, where, as I said, that supply is, a bit higher than the demand, even today, and we still see some of those. But where those markets exist, you will see it. But we are expecting a quicker than average recovery. And this is going to be largely driven not through the financial institutions or managing the interest rate, but simply because we're going to head right back into the situation we had today, which is this acute kind of skills-based labor shortage. That will, raise prices and kind of, abate the impact coming from the recession. And so as we head into that position where, interest rates start to climb, we see consumer behaviors start to shift, personal spending start to slow down a little bit, we will see the reality of a recession start to manifest itself in certain areas. We will see acute labor shortages in certain cohorts and also certain industries, but it won't be universal. So we won't see the same impact everywhere. And then fundamentally, we're expecting a much quicker recovery than we would in a sort of a traditional, quote unquote, traditional recession that we've seen in the past. And again, this is largely driven by some of the stats that we've seen, a newly empowered workforce, and a reality that we have a constrained economy. And so as a result, our Canadian labor force represents probably our most precious resource we have. We do not have an infinite supply, and it's constrained insofar as we have restricted groups that actually have higher employment. We have those that have higher unemployment. We have a reliance on new Canadians arriving to fulfill the career aspirations that they have and to meet the economic demands that we have. And so that's kind of the silver lining that we start to see when we think about what's the future. But then there's the reality of, even beyond that, what am I to do? If you're telling me this problem isn't going to go away, how do I actually address this with my organization, with the employees that I have, and the future demographics that I will employ. So when we start to look at this, we've seen some really interesting tactics from different organizations. And we talk about human potential, and there's a really fascinating thing around if you take the tasks that you do in a day and you were to break it down, how many of those tasks actually give you value, actually lift you up and make you feel like you're productive? I can guarantee there's probably a couple dozen things you have to do in your day that really just drag you down. Why am I doing this? I can think of a few that I have to do myself that frankly don't lift me up. And they take your time away. They actually reduce your overall capacity. And so what we're seeing is organizations, instead of looking at task analysis as ways to constrain your workforce, we're actually looking at ways to unlock your workforce. So if I can look at all the things that my team does, and if I can find 5, 6, 7 things that they do that offer no value, that actually just reduce their overall capacity, and take those away. Maybe I automate them. Maybe I invest in low-cost automation. Maybe I invest in outsourcing. Maybe I consolidate with parallel organizations and we do more of a shared service model. Whatever that is, you can actually unlock capacity. And then you have a choice. What do I do with that capacity? Do I give it back to my employees in free time? Is it thinking time? Do I give it back to them to explore their own career development? And you'll see an example on the screen of Unilever. It's a great example where, yes, as a big global organization, they have the latitude to explore some of these concepts. But they did a pilot of an internal talent marketplace, which is this idea of forget your job. Your job's irrelevant. We don't care. What we want to know is your skills and your talents and what you're capable of doing. We'll take care of the job tasks. So those mundane things that you have to do. So you can focus on the work, the productive things that you need to do. It ended up unlocking something like 26,000 hours across the workforce within 60 days. And at the end of 2020, you can see about 500,000 hours have been unlocked through the talent marketplace. So again, this is really focusing on a capacity piece, which is how do I figure out those things that you're doing and how do I open up your capabilities to connect, work, and be more fluid across the things that you need to do. And we see this small scale too. Myself, I've been involved in projects where even just simple things like interviewing and selection, using simple tools like assessments. In one organization, we freed up 240 hours of interview time across 2 requisitions. Those 240 hours were hugely important to the organization because that meant this is time that my shop floor managers don't have to be taken out of the shop. It was focused on they remained productive and we removed that work from them. And as a result, reduced that time and increased overall capacity and production outputs and very low cost. And so the idea is thinking about those types of moments as capacity gains and not thinking of it as a way to reduce costs necessarily, but how do I improve capacity and drive that productivity back into my organization? And again, when we found this piece earlier, and I did allude to this, development and growth is huge, right? And so what we do see is depending on the demographics, when you look at your workforce, sometimes that capacity is just used for learning, right? How do I give it back to my team members so I can actually focus on development? In the case of millennials, 69% identify that growth and learning is important to them. And so, talk about a great retention tool, right? If I can free up those little incremental things that they do and give that back as development and learning moments, right? That's a powerful way I can actually allow myself to retain my millennial group and start to, non-millennial group and start to retain them and actually engage them in different ways. So, there's fun things you can do in this space, but the idea here first and foremost is how do I actually find this capacity? How do I understand the things that we're doing? What's the mundane? What's the dull? What holds me back from unlocking my potential? Get rid of those somehow. And it's fascinating. Some of these are very cheap to do in terms of getting rid of things. In our research, we found, AI assistants for $12 a month. And when you look at some of the stats that they do in terms of managing a calendar for you, just as a quick example, $12 a month, and they free up, an hour a week, multiply that 52 weeks a year. That's a lot of time for $12, right? And so we get lost sometimes in seeing examples like Unilever or thinking of big organizations, and we start to realize is there's a lot of tools out there available to us that are incredibly low cost, many of them subscription based, that actually find me my capacity, right? Free up my time, focus on the business I need to run, unlock my team's potential, and again, tap into our human potential, really, and the whole capability that we have. And so you've heard me talk about productivity, and it's fascinating because this is a new emerging area, I'll say. We know productivity in terms of outputs. Very easy in a production-based environment. You have a threshold or an index, and you measure yourself against that. We see this quite commonly. We used to hear, how many barrels per day were being produced in the oil sands, things like that. But if I asked you individually, yesterday, did you have a productive day? I see 39 people online, I'd get 39 different answers, right? And that's the reality, because we measure productivity very differently than we did before. And so there's the effectiveness value, there's an efficiency value, but then there's this empowerment. So I can be effective and I can be efficient, but if I don't feel empowered in my day, if I feel like an order taker, as it were, I don't feel like I had a productive day because I didn't do anything. I just did the tasks. But if I feel empowered on top of that, if I feel like I actually made a difference and I did something, I now feel like I was productive. And igniting that empowerment piece is very tricky to do and also very difficult to measure. It's not something that is universal. My definition of empowerment is going to be different than everybody else on the line. But the balance of understanding these three things is going to be what makes for a productive workforce going forward in the future. And so when you look at effectiveness, we talk about growth in output per hour. We are seeing this, right? The amount of things I can do in an hour has gone up. And we've seen enabling tools like Zoom that we're all on right now, right? Eliminated the need to commute, right? And that downtime you would have doing that. So this allows you to be more productive on an hourly basis. We're seeing efficiency. Famously, Microsoft piloted the 4-day work week, and they saw a 40% increase in productivity as measured by efficiency gains. And so we know we can drive efficiency. Tools are there. As I said, there's much more enablement around us to actually be more efficient. Auto planning schedules, different things like that. Even just the simplest thing like seeing shared calendars allows us to be much more efficient. And then we get to the tricky one, which is the empowerment piece. The kind of this idea of windowed work. So breaking your work down into cycles or chunks of your day that integrate personal and work time. For myself, I know I have time blocked in my day every day to close my computer and go for a run. That's what I do. I couldn't do that if I was downtown or if I was, driving around meeting clients or on a plane, right? Delivering projects anywhere in Canada. And so this idea of being able to balance my time and try to get that ownership of my calendar back starts to get into this idea of empowerment. And so, but we need help here. You can see them, arranging this helps be more productive, but we can't do this on our own. You may do it as an individual. You may have that time blocked in your calendar, but as meetings come in, as requests come in, as client requests come in, we often sacrifice that time and we give it back and we kind of lose it. And then our empowerment starts to dissipate. And then we're back to this question of, did you have a productive day? And you reflect and say, well, I did what I said I was doing. I did more, maybe. I met with X number of people as well as my clients, but it's 6 o'clock and I feel like I didn't do anything, right? I feel like I didn't actually own my day. I was just, somebody owned it for me. And so measuring productivity is hard to do, right? In this new kind of world of work that we're talking about. And it's shifted fundamentally. And so when you think about this in your workforce, as they wonder, did I have a productive day? It's going to be an interesting question around how do I actually embrace this? How do I measure it? And how do I talk to my teams about this as a way to retain them so they do feel like you're being productive, right? So they don't fall back into that burnout phase where I do a lot of work without the return. And so really critically important in terms of how do I measure this and how do I re-engage my workforce so I can avoid the burnout, and focus on recharging my workforce rather than having to deal with, again, a great resignation on hand. So where are we at? This is a big impact. And so when we start to unpack this, these tasks, these inefficient things we do, our loss in productivity, right? This devaluing of work. Goldman Sachs did a study. They figured it's about 1 trillion hours. That's staggering. That's a lot. It's hard to kind of wrap our heads around. So when you look at it on a per employee, it's about 800 hours per year that we are not actively productive. We're not feeling purpose or meaning. And they went a little further and helped understand what this was. So, 270 hours in unnecessary meetings, 209 hours in duplicating work, 320 hours on context switching, which is just basically going back and forth, back and forth. And this is a big impact. And so a couple pieces here. Meeting times have increased 148% through a study through Microsoft as they started to look at the new data they actually collect from Office 365 and Teams, and we can start to get those reports in our inboxes. It's gone up staggering. And when look at the increase year over year, I'm not even going to reference these numbers because they get to a scale that's just beyond my comprehension. What we start to understand is, we read these and then we go back to that question: are we productive? Our outputs have gone up, our efficiency has gone up, but do you feel empowered? And again, this is what our workforce is struggling with right now, right? If I don't feel empowered to do this is where we're going to start to see, again, the resignations continue, people start to leave work, and there's no pursuant need to actually look at how do I transfer my skills and change my capabilities to where I need to go. There's other stats out there in terms of this skills piece that I want to reference quickly. So there was a study around reskilling the workforce that was done not that long ago, and the estimate around what does it cost. And so when you looked at the global workforce, the skills gap we have, so this piece that we're talking about, right? This idea of people resigning, finding work in other parallel industries that are seeing growth, seeing acute skills shortages, not necessarily workforce shortage, but skills. I think it was about $500 billion in real GDP impact. And so this is the impact that you as business owners, you as business leaders are starting to face, is you're seeing that impact, profitability and sales and revenue. This is the impact that's having. We have excess supply in certain areas without the right skills, and we are still trying to tap into this workforce by looking at I need you to do this job. But if you think about what we talked about, if that job isn't driving productivity, if it isn't meaningful, if it's got many mundane things you need to do, the likelihood of finding transferability from one labor pool to the next starts to go down. And so the more we can unpack work, actually look at the things that somebody might do in their day-to-day and focus on how to remove the mundane, what we start to find is the skills needed to complete those remaining tasks are highly transferable. You don't need to look for specific roles in the marketplace. Your job posting on Indeed or LinkedIn doesn't have to be restricted to a very boxed in job title with very crisp, clear responsibilities and skills that you need. You can actually be more open because you're looking at transferability of individuals, which means you can tap into new labor pools. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we still have more people than we do work at the moment. We're close, but we still do. And the ability to actually use those variabilities of tasks and skills as ways to attract parallel people becomes really interesting. You see increased retention as a result. People will stay longer when they can utilize their skills versus perform tasks. You can start to identify, as I said, net new talent pools. So ones that you would have historically avoided and not gone to, you can now go into those. And I mentioned earlier about mining. We saw a really good example not that long ago where a big portion of mining in Sudbury, so if you look to Northern Ontario, Saskatchewan, BC, and Alberta, is maintenance. It's actually not the mining role we tend to think about. It's how do you maintain all this equipment, right? And it breaks down and so forth. And so you need a lot of mechanics, you need a lot of engineers. And then we looked at the automotive sector and looking at the layoffs that are actually happening in automotive across internal combustion sectors. And the realization is, wow, these are people who are engineers, they understand basic mechanics, they understand problem solving. And there's about 8,000 of them in North America that were just recently displaced. That's a great talent pool, right? And so identifying the transferability of that into maintenance within mining was a very short gap to close. You're talking about training programs that are just a couple of weeks or maybe a few months. Changing the nature of relocation, changing the nature of time on site, time off site, and giving people new career opportunities to enter a different sector. And again, a huge shift in thinking, but immediately there's 8,000 people that weren't there before in the talent market, and easy to engage, relatively same cost benchmark. All it was investment in training and skills and realizing that these people have the core capabilities I need. I just need to train them on the basic skills of the role. And so there are practical examples out there where we're seeing this start to take place, and then kind of reevaluating, reconnecting with individuals in terms of the right places and looking at the right markets. So keeping on that theme of what do we do? As I said, it's not all doom and gloom. We unpack workforce and workplace, as I mentioned, looking at the things that you do, the tasks that you perform, and unlocking those through things like automation, new technology, small incremental ways. Sometimes just stop doing tasks that offer no value. We look at the workforce, things that could be done differently, like engaging gig workers and crowdsourcing, and reimagining new ways to understand and develop output. And then the workplace. We didn't talk a lot about this, but this is the idea of where are you physically located? How is it designed? How do you engage? And what's the culture? So those kind of three come together to define an experience for an individual. What I do, who I work with, and where do I do it, fundamentally create the triangle of experience for individuals. Mindful of time, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. But as an organization, it's how do I access talent? How do I curate it? And how do I engage it? And so you'll see some examples here, but ultimately it's, as we talked about, if I understand where people are in terms of capabilities and skills, not jobs, but skills and capabilities, I can identify new talent pools. I can curate them, think about their experience, grow them, cultivate them, and then I can focus on how do I engage them? What are the policies I have in place? How do I enable them for those micro empowerment moments to make decisions that they couldn't make before? Knowing that they have more capacity now than they did before, I can start to collect their feedback. They can participate directly in engaging, creating new ideas. There's a great example NASA uses. They take ideas from anywhere. If you work at NASA, it doesn't matter what your role is, you can take part in any project possible, which is a fundamental statement to make. I'm just mindful of time because I'm just going to clip ahead here. But I mean, where do you start? I think ultimately it's, again, getting disciplined about those future skills, right? So reducing those tasks that are mundane, focus on the capabilities you need. There are talent pools out there, you can engage them. Looking at data. So how do you actually track this, right? How do I do this? How do I invest the time to take a moment and use data to define how much capacity could I free? Understand that piece so you can quantify the investment and the return on that investment as a result. And then look at the strategy for new ways of working. And we talked a lot about different things, different ways of working. You've heard concepts like 4-day work weeks, work from home 1 day a week, different ideas of shift sharing. So lots of opportunities there to explore actual strategies that focus on retention, giving learning and development opportunities to retain the workforce you have. But I will stop there because I think I'm a little bit over time. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mike. That was wonderful and really informative. I found the piece on millennial workers interesting because I would say that's what I look from my employer is an opportunity to learn and grow. And I think when I reflect back on my work, I think where I've not been able to learn and grow, I've pursued other opportunities with other organizations that I think would provide me with that. So we do have a little time. Mike mentioned finishing early. We do have a little time to take questions, and I did see one in the chat. I'm just going to pull it up while I see if there's any other hands out there. So Mike, the question comes from Maleficent Lavers. Is it possible that the 4-day work week is effective in the short term for those who are, I think, used to their employer, but for new employees, it wouldn't increase on productivity? So I think what they're asking is they're saying, established workers are in their workplace, 4 days a week works really brilliantly for them because they don't have to navigate new systems, new people. But is this an effective engagement strategy for new workers?
Mm-hmm. So there's interesting. One of the things I get to do in my spare time is work with some of our human-centered design experts. Onboarding is one of the most tumultuous times for new talent. And if you think about it, you're stressed, you're pressured, you're nervous, anxiety. And what we found is actually it's the highest risk for turn is the first 3 months. And if you think about that extra day, let's say if you did the 4-day work week and you had your new joiners go through the same experience, think of the decompression they can do on that day and the work that they could do even just personally on that moment. We often find, believe it or not, job seeking behavior increases after someone joins. And so, it could actually be a powerful retention. So I don't have a clear answer because it's a very, very, very interesting question. And I love the hypothesis behind it. And I would love to study more, but I think just knowing what we know about human behaviors and onboarding, I could actually see it being quite powerful because it's that moment of, man, right now I'm 5 days through my onboarding. I'm super nervous. I'm learning people. I'm meeting who I need to know, processes, policies, production. I have to figure it all out. I head into a 2-day weekend. I tell my friends about my experience in my first week, right? Good or bad, they're going to hear about it. I tell my family about it, and then I'm back to work on Monday. So it could be an interesting decompression window where it's packed in 4 days. I can reflect. I can kind of moderate my own mindset against what I just took in and then come back Monday feeling productive. So unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer, but it is an interesting way to actually kind of approach it and whether or not it could be done or does it change those behaviors perhaps.
Oh, and interestingly, the question was actually not new to the organization, but in fact, new to work. So it says in France, they switched to 35 hours a week and productivity increased. And then it didn't because no one knew what it was like to do more hours than from before. So I guess for new workers like college folks entering from the workforce, is that 4 days a week appropriate? Or I think what they're saying here, the bar was maybe set a little lower and then productivity didn't result.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a good question. I mean, it's very similar, right? It's when you're new to work, you have those same anxieties. We hire a lot of co-ops and a lot of interns, obviously, through Deloitte, and we see that anxiety manifest itself. But I think it's working norms starts to become, that reality. For us, the 40-hour work week is a working norm, and it's been like that forever. Changing behavior is interesting, right? As we see behavioral shifts in a workforce are not easy to predict. We, as Canada, also represent an incredible opportunity of multiculturalism. And so what we may find here is we may start to have people who have different working norms come here and realize 40 hours is nothing. I'm used to working 50. And we see that at Deloitte quite a bit. And so I think there's going to be an adjustment window that'll start to happen as those norms start to manifest themselves in predictable behaviors. But I can tell you, looking at the Canadian workforce, because of our multiculturalism, we have people enter workforce who work 40, work 30, right? Work 50. And there's always going to be that lag in productivity as people adjust. I don't think that'll go away anytime soon. At least for us, it won't. But where you have regulated propositions like in France, and I've heard a few other countries exploring the same thing, I think you're going to be looking at least a year or so of kind of immeasurable productivity until those working behaviors start to normalize. And again, that's just a prediction looking at some of the stats that we see.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I don't know that the new bill in Ontario really changed the way we work. So there's, that new bill that your employer is not to reach out to you after office hours. And I don't know that I saw much impact or change after that bill than before. I think it was kind of something that came and went with like very little fodder. So we'll see. And the questioner does mention 2 different kind of distinct groups at work.
Mm-hmm.
There's also another question, and I would say I've even experienced this in my own work and bringing people back and coming back to work on my own. We have people coming into the office 2 days a week and are receiving strong pushback. Basically, they don't want to come in at all. Not sure if you have any suggestions or what others are finding when employees don't want to return to work.
Yeah. So we look at return to office right now. There is a whole spectrum of things that are happening. And the problem is, how do you create equity against this experience? What we're finding is, middle grounds where we're seeing core working hours. It's a concept that's come up now. And so we're seeing mandated 2 days a week, whenever you want, and core hours, which is a new piece, which is, I think, depending on your organization, call it 10 till 2. And so we're seeing that. We've seen just mandated 3 days a week, Monday to Friday. We've seen 3 days a week, pick your own. We've seen 3 on, 3 off. So we've seen so many different versions of this. And I think the idea is you need to anchor on the flexibility piece, right? And so some of the other models we're starting to see is just hours in the office. So whatever you want, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be in 2 days a week, but maybe on a monthly basis, there's a certain number of hours. And the other thing I would ask is why, right? What's the push to be in the office? Does the work require it? There's nothing more demotivating than commuting for an hour, sitting down, putting my hands on a keyboard and doing data entry for an hour, and then or 8 hours, then drive home for an hour. What was the point? And so the other thing is, what's the reason for bringing them into the office? If it's team building, it's cultural driven, if it's collaborative, there's value to that, right? That's something that's very hard to replicate. And we're doing a Zoom call. I think it's going well, but sometimes face-to-faces, there's a uniqueness to that comes with that type of conversation. So I would unpack the work, see what it's about, and then think about how do you offer flexibility based on work. And so some individuals may have like an hours base, some might have to be on site. And then you can actually create different personas of work as a result. And you may have 3 or 4 personas across your workforce, and individuals fall into those personas. And it gives you a new way to manage and approach. And actually gives people career variability as well. So if I know my work falls in this persona and I don't really want to do that for the rest of my life, maybe you can cross-functionally train me and I can actually aspire. And now that I have that opportunity, I'll actually look to you for my next career move rather than looking out, which is again, feeding back into the Great Resignation. So if you can embed flexibility, it also becomes an indirect, very powerful retention tool as well. But there is no clear-cut thing I can say today that says, oh, do this and you'll be fine. Sadly, I know you want to hear that. But there's so much variability. And like I said earlier, humans are weird. We're amazing. We're not predictable all the time. And so what works for one doesn't work for the other. And I think it's great. And so you just have to kind of operate with that mindset and think about how you embed flexibility and then use that as a retention tool.
I was an epidemiologist in my former life. So you saying that humans aren't predictable really just pinged me there. And I would say even in returning to work, I've adjusted my expectations of being back at work. So when I think of being on site, I plan to do no deep work that day. Right. I really even like loosely plan to answer emails. I'm just planning to engaging with my team, to engaging with faculty, engaging with students. And I would say that's a big shift from what I used to do. So really where you're talking about that segmented work, I used to have segmented work at work where I would close my door and do deep work and then have it more fluid. Now I really just plan to be on campus for certain days and have planned engagements all day and then do deep work when I'm at home and not sitting in an office.
Yep.
So it's been an interesting and changing trend. I'll maybe ask one more question. What we've seen too, when you were talking about the equity of work and the equity of working from home, and what we're really concerned at as in an academic institution is that there'll be a great kind of resignation from our front-facing offices or front-facing roles, which have to be on campus 5 days a week, into more hybrid roles. And we're really not sure how to address or change that. And we see it as a large risk within our organization where people are trying to move into hybrid roles, out of roles that require them to be there. And do you have suggestions in that place? Do we move to automation if we can, or is it finding the right candidate?
Yeah, I think so. There's this concept of like work architecture. So we see this, if anybody ever goes to the US to do grocery shopping for whatever reason, Trader Joe's is a interesting experience as a consumer, but it's what they do with their workforce that I find very interesting. So when you go to a Trader Joe's, they have your department supervisor, your dairy, your produce, deli, and so forth. But anybody can cover for that role. And what ends up happening is they actually rotate their workforce across all those positions. And when you're in that position, you have autonomy over the inventory, the displays, everything. For the context of retail, it's very rare. Usually you start, your job is to stack produce and that's pretty much all you do. So what they do is they say, yes, you do that, but plus you also have to take part in the ordering process. You have to meet the drivers when they drop off. You have to, there's all these little things that they have to do as a result of that. And it sounds like they're adding to the work, but what they've done is actually they take, a 16-year-old who's new, first job, and all of a sudden they have these additional responsibilities and tasks that are very empowering. And what the company has said is, I want your opinion and your decision because you're closest to the problem. You're the one dealing with this day in and day out. It's less about your supervisor, it's more about you. And so they actually distributed those supervisor responsibilities down into the workforce. And they could do little things as well. So they removed the idea of the customer service desk. The idea is if you need to return a product or whatever it is, the person, anybody in the store can do it for you. You don't have to go to customer service and say, oh, I dropped my peanut butter jar, I need a new one. You can go to anybody. That person can go evaluate the situation, determine right then and there, yes, no problem here, let me get one for you, just take it and go. They actually empowered store associates to reward individuals as well. So they give flowers to customers because if they had a great experience with the customer, they can actually reward them. But the idea was they distributed the supervisor response. So that's the key kind of theme. And so if you think about those frontline roles you may have in terms of either front desk, security, maintenance, all those types of things, it's how do you empower them to make decisions so that they don't have to just focus on the task, right? Think of that productivity piece that we talked about. If you don't feel empowered, they're not going to make those decisions. And then you're right, that risk remains as they pursue opportunities where they feel like they're a bit more respected or more valued to make decisions. And so it's not like I said, it's not a simple answer because you have to determine the architecture of work. What are the things you do? What responsibilities can I actually disseminate down to those levels? And in doing so, I raise them up. Their role becomes more valuable. They have more autonomy, more responsibility in their role. And again, driving that retention factor. It does level off the organization, so it's not so hierarchical. It kind of switches to more of a flat mindset, but the empowerment goes a long, long way. And when you look at frontline hourly workers, and you look at the reasons they leave, that's one of those probably top 5. And so if you can address that and actually just re-architect the work a little bit differently, you can improve retention quite substantially.
Oh, good. Well, I will take that back to Janet, our president, and make sure that I'm crediting you with the response because it's a challenge that we're really concerned about and the one that we kind of face every day.
Yep.
And one that we've struggled to answer. So with that, we're almost at time. So I will just say that if people have more questions, where could they look for you for information as we're kind of ending today?
So Deloitte publishes a lot of research. And so I always encourage everybody to check our website under our research section. I believe also the links for some of the reports that I've referenced are going to be shared to this group and published on the Board of Trade site. And I think we're also going to be sharing this deck out as well. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn. I love connecting with people, so feel free to connect with me there as well.
Absolutely. And there were many questions about the slides, so I'm sure everybody is thankful that they will be posted. So thank you again, and thanks you to Deloitte for working on these burning topics, and again to Algoma for their sponsorship. Next up for the Brampton Board of Trade is the AGM, so that's November 17th. It's a chance to connect with other business leaders to learn about what is ahead for BBOT. Please also start thinking about the very best and most impactful businesses in Brampton that should be celebrated at our annual Business Excellence Award. Nominations will be open soon. And for all events, don't forget to check your inbox every Friday morning for the Weekly Advocate and on our socials at Brampton Bot. I look forward to seeing everyone soon and have a great day. Thank you, Mike.